I'm Rabbi Richard Block, I'm Senior Rabbi of the Temple, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight to what I know is going to be a very important and stimulating program. My role is limited to welcoming you, and I'm pleased to do that. We're always happy to partner with the Malta Museum of Jewish Heritage, with Case Western Reserve University, and to make this facility available to the community and to our partners. Just a word about this room before we put down the shades so you'll be able to see the screen better. This room, this chapel, is the crown jewel of the Temple's Temple Tomorrow project. And those of you who are familiar with the Temple at University Circle may remember these windows, although not as glorious as they are now. These 12 windows and the 3 in the chapel lobby were designed by the famous artist Arthur Schick in the mid-20th century. Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, of blessed memory, created a war service alcove to honor the service of members of the congregation who served in World War II. The 3 out in the lobby are the so-called warrior windows: Gideon, Samson, and Judah Maccabee, 3 of the great warriors of Jewish history. And these 12 each represent one of the 12 tribes of Israel. You'll note that on each window there are names in yellow, and those are the names of the 22 members of the Temple who died in the service of our country in World War II. So this room represents, in some sense, the history and heritage of the congregation, set in a beautiful contemporary setting. The tradition, the juxtaposition, as it were, of tradition and innovation. It also acknowledges the debt that we have, not just as a congregants, of course, but as a nation, for those who served our country. And as we gather on Yom HaShoah, we're well aware of how many have suffered and died, and how many stood finally in defense of Western values and of common humanity to create and preserve the world that we have. So we don't take for granted the chance to have a great scholar with us tonight and to be able to partner with these wonderful institutions. So a warm welcome. We hope this will be just one of many occasions when you join us in this beautiful chapel and in our facility, which we very much want to make available to the wider community. Bruchim habeim, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. So nice to see all of you here gathered this evening, and thank you, Rabbi Block, for your remarks. This is really a wonderful way to mark the last hours of Yom HaShoah here. My name is Alana Cooper. I direct Jewish lifelong learning at Case Western Reserve University's Siegal Lifelong Learning Program. And this is such an honor to be here this evening. Before I speak about our speaker, Professor Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, and also before the many thank yous of the different organizations and people that we worked with to bring this program together, I do want to just have you keep in mind to put on your radar screen 2 of our upcoming programs in May. We're going to have visiting Israeli author here, Ayelet Sabari. She'll be here in the beginning of May for a series of lectures and workshops. And also to mark on your calendars that in honor of Yom Yerushalayim, marking 50 years since the 1967 Day War, we'll have Professor Benny Morris here, professor at Ben-Gurion University, who's in the States for the year, and we're really privileged to have him come specifically speak on Yom Yerushalayim about the legacy of the Six-Day War. Keep your eyes open for advertising, and also out in the front, we have all sorts of postcards and promotional material. Please collect it on your way out. Turning my attention to what we have here this evening, as I said, I'm so happy to have been able to work with a number of organizations in our community to bring Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett here. First of all, we have to thank the Temple-Tifereth Israel's Museum of Jewish Art, Religion, and Culture, to thank the Maltz Museum for also helping to support and work with Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett during her visit, and also the Office of the Deputy Provost, Lynn Singer, both for a grant from ACE's Distinguished Lectureship, and also Professor Singer's overall support of everything that we do at the Siegal Lifelong Learning Program. She's here with us this evening. I don't know where you are. Back there. And we're so happy to have you with us. And one other thing that's really important to mention, this lecture is entitled the Salo-Baron Annual Lecture. And I want to say a few things about Salo-Baron. The lecture is supported by the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Baron Foundation. Professor Salo-Baron was born in Galicia in 1895, and he came to this country in the 1920s. He is really known for his path-breaking scholarly work in Jewish history. I myself, as a Jewish historian, have his 15-volume Jewish history on my own bookshelves and really understand his place in creating a narrative of Jewish history that totally changed the way we think about the Jewish past, both through his scholarship, but also because of the position that he occupied as the Miller Chair at Columbia University, which was the first position in Jewish history at any secular Western university in the United States or in Europe. And in that sense, really the academic field of Jewish history in the United States and Europe is largely indebted to the foundation set down by Professor Baron. And we are so lucky and honored to have Professor Baron's daughter here with us from Phoenix, Shoshana Tanzer, and her husband, Bob Tanzer, as well as Professor Baron's granddaughter, Cynthia Tanzer, and her husband, Louis Giesler, here with us in the audience this evening. At this point, I want to turn my attention to Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who I've had the pleasure to spend time with since she came in to Cleveland last night. She's here from Warsaw, where she's been living for the past 10 years. She was born in Toronto during World War II to Jewish immigrants from Poland. Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett has served as professor of performance studies at New York University since 1981 and as a distinguished university professor there since 2002. Her work is interdisciplinary by nature. She draws together her expertise in Jewish studies and also in theory and history of museums, tourism, and heritage. And you'll see in her talk the way she brings these disparate fields together in such a beautiful way. She has so many accomplishments, I could not begin to list them here because that would be the whole lecture. So I'm just going to highlight a few that are really relevant to this evening. One is that she was one of the co-editors of a book that was published in 2006 called Writing a Modern Jewish History, Essays in Honor of Salo-Baron. So that's really a wonderful link for this Salo-Baron Memorial Lecture this evening. She currently serves as the chief curator of POLIN, and really was the visionary curator of this museum of 1,000 years of Jewish history, which is located in Warsaw. And the last thing that I want to tell you about her accomplishments is that just over a week ago, she was elected to the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is considered to be one of the nation's highest honors. And we are so privileged to have you here with us this morning. Please give Professor Kirshenblatt-Gimblett a very warm Cleveland welcome.
Thank you very, very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I want to thank Alana Cooper for the invitation. I want to thank the Baron family for making this lecture possible. I think it's a wonderful way to honor the memory of a truly magisterial historian. I had the good fortune of knowing Salo-Baron because when I came to New York City and was teaching at Columbia in the 1970s, Professor Baron ran a faculty seminar in a grand Columbia University tradition at the faculty club. And of course, being a very young person in the field, I was really completely in awe of Professor Baron, but also other members of this august company, which included Hannah Arendt. And you can well imagine for somebody in their 20s who's just starting out as an academic, what an extraordinary experience that was. And so I'm deeply, deeply honored to be speaking this evening in honor of and in memory of Salo-Baron. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of POLIN Museum. And this is a comment that was made by Arnold Eisen, Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, in October 2014, when they had the grand opening of POLIN Museum. This is where we've created the museum. We've literally created it on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, on the rubble of what had been the pre-war Jewish neighborhood, on the rubble of the place where the largest Jewish community in Europe once lived, and at a time, the largest Jewish community in the world. And this area of rubble remained this way for quite a long time, and it was in 1948, on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that the monument to the Ghetto Heroes by Nathan Rappaport was unveiled on the rubble of the ghetto. And in the background, you can see the destroyed city of Warsaw, because in 1944, there was the Warsaw Uprising, and when the Germans suppressed that uprising, they destroyed 85% of the main part of the city of Warsaw. So this area was completely devastated. The monument to the Ghetto Heroes was a monument that Rappaport was already planning when he was in the Soviet Union. As soon as he heard about the uprising, he was already planning the monument. And on one side, he commemorates the Ghetto Heroes, and on the other side, he commemorates the deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka in the summer of 1942. And until the idea for this museum arose, basically there was an empty park, a plaza, that had been left empty on purpose in front of the monument, and that whole area was surrounded by communist-era housing. You can imagine with the destroyed city, the enormous need to immediately create housing. And so this area stayed blank like this between 1948 and the moment that we opened POLIN Museum. The idea for the museum arose really at the inspiration of the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington in 1993. And it was initiated by a Jewish NGO. And the whole idea was that the museum would complete the memorial complex, that it was that orange area that had been marked out was an area that the city of Warsaw had designated that in the event of a miracle, that such a museum would actually get built, this would be the place where it would be, and it would face the monument. And by facing the monument, it would complete the memorial complex. In other words, we would go to the monument to honor the Jews who died by remembering how they died. And we would turn around and come into the museum, and we would honor them by remembering how they lived, and how they lived for 1,000 years. 1,000 years of continuous Jewish presence in this part of the world. And that the task of memory is not complete if we only remember how Jews died. That we have a moral obligation also to recover their lives and the world that they created. Because the loss of 6 million European Jews, 3 million Polish Jews, we also lost the world that they created. And to lose the memory of that world as well was something that we felt a moral obligation to do something about. And so the museum is built in a relationship to the monument and completes the memorial complex. And the museum is clad in glass, which is a very unusual thing to do. When we think of buildings that are created on sites of genocide, we think of buildings that are made of concrete or titanium or some kind of brutal metal, militaristic kind of metal or concrete materials. This museum is completely clad in glass, and the glass is like fins on a fish, or like scales on a fish, like this. It's not sheer glass. And on the glass is silk screened the word POLIN, and I'll explain that in a moment, in Hebrew letters and in Roman letters. And as a result, this glass building on a site of genocide conveys, I would say, a message of hope in the face of tragedy. And that the building is full of light, it's open, it's transparent, and it reflects every change in clouds and in weather and in season. And all the drama is on the inside. And so the brief to the architect was that the building should stand in a respectful relationship to the monument, not higher than the communist-era buildings, and that it should be discreet. And so the architect who won the competition, Rainer Mahlamaki, a Finnish architect, I'm convinced it had to be somebody modest, somebody Scandinavian, somebody from Northern Europe, that would be so, if you will, minimalist and discreet and modest on the exterior, and then fill the building with this drama on the inside, and you can see how beautiful the light is. It's from the ground floor of the main, from the main entrance and the main floor, and what we call the grand hall of the museum's building, that we enter the permanent exhibition, or the core exhibition. No exhibition is permanent, so we prefer to call it the core exhibition. And I had the responsibility of leading the development of the core exhibition. Now, you can well understand that in a situation where we've got basically no historic buildings, no historic fabric, where we do not start with a pre-existing collection, and we have a 1,000-year story to tell, that it's imperative that we find a compelling way to tell this story. And so we created a multimedia narrative exhibition that I like to think of as a theater of history. So it's a theater of history in the sense that it's a theater of mise-en-scène, it's a scenographic approach. We create a total environment. You are, in a sense, an actor on the stage, and you're surrounded by the story. And as you walk, the story unfolds. And that was the basic fundamental approach. Now, of course, there are objects, there are collections, and the most important collection is at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. But it's largely a collection of Judaica and of late paintings, drawings, photographs, documents, materials of that kind, mainly late 19th century and 20th century. And we have a 1,000-year story to tell. So how are we going to tell it, and how did the project evolve? Well, for me, it was very important that this initiative, and the idea came in 1993, that this initiative was an initiative of a Jewish NGO in Warsaw, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, that had been established in 1951 in Poland, and is the single most important, largest Jewish philanthropic organization in Poland. So it was a Jewish initiative. And this is an idea that came 4 years after the fall of communism, which is extraordinary, 4 years after the fall of communism. It took a while for the association to say, okay, we're going to go from an idea and try and do something, and in a sense, it began as a kind of project in 1996. And I am convinced that only people who were so idealistic and so unrealistic could ever have embarked on such a project. Because at that time, to have been a realist, you would have said, no way, it's not possible. And so in the absence of basically, they didn't have the funding, and this is a little Jewish NGO that had never made a museum and never made an exhibition and never raised any money to speak of. They took what little money they had been able to raise, and between 2000 and 2004, they created a master plan for the whole exhibition without even knowing what the building would be. And they worked with a design company in London that specialized in the creating of multimedia narrative exhibitions. And with that master plan in hand, they went to the city of Warsaw and the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage, and they signed an agreement to found the museum, and in that year they created the architectural competition. And the result is a unique private-public partnership for a major cultural institution in Poland. Very unusual, because most museums are actually state museums, and there are a few small private ones. Architectural competition in 2005 attracted more than 200 submissions. There were 11 finalists. Among the finalists were luminaries like Daniel Libeskind, but many of these finalists, they were so grandiose, and the gestures, they were starchitects, and it was starchitecture, and it was so grandiose that it really violated the basic fundamental principle of a building that would stand in a respectful relationship. Now, the architects say that second prize is the best prize because you get the prize and you don't have to build it. But I can assure you that Daniel Libeskind is not of that school of thought. So in 2013, we opened the building, and in 2014, we had our grand opening with the opening of the core exhibition. And in 2016, we've had more than 2 million visitors from the opening until now, which means on average between 500 and 600, closer to 600,000 visitors a year, which is extraordinary. There's no Jewish museum in North America that has that kind of visitorship, and I don't think anyone expected. We had actually projected 500,000, and we're actually meeting the target. And we won actually 3 of the biggest prizes in Europe in 2016, the European Museum of the Year Award, the European Museum Academy Prize, and now in 2017, we just won the Europa Nostra Award for our education program. Now, I like to say that this is an exhibition with a narrative, but without a master narrative. That is to say, a one-line story that takes you from the beginning to the end with only one way of thinking about that narrative line. But a colleague of mine, Moshe Rossman, who is a professor at Bar Ilan in Israel, he said, yes, true, but there are some general principles that are guiding your story. And together, we started to define what they are. And let me just indicate a few of them, because these are, I have this feeling that had Salah Baron lived to see this museum, I actually think that it would be a realization of his view of Jewish history. And I keep on thinking, I sort of think of him behind me, looking over my shoulders, and I'm thinking to myself, I think he would like this exhibition. So the first principle is this longue durée, and that was definitely what he was about. 1,000 years of Jewish presence on Polish soil. Why is this important? Well, I'm often asked, what's the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And usually whoever asks already knows. For many, it's the Holocaust. Some said it should have been a Holocaust museum. And for others, it's the post-war years because it's the period through which they lived. And for others, it might be the interwar years, which is the period of my parents being born and growing up in Poland. Nobody says the medieval period. And the medieval period is more than half of the millennium. Nobody. But my answer is that the single most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years, all of it. That's the message. 1,000 years of continuous Jewish presence. Now, of course, understandably, that 1,000 years of Jewish presence has been understandably overshadowed by the cataclysmic catastrophe of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust has come to define that 1,000-year history. And that's something that we struggle with, and I'm going to try to show you how we deal with that. The second is that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland. They're not only in Poland, but they're also of Poland. And that's a very important message because I think that in the historiography of Polish Jews, there has been a tendency to see Polish Jews as somehow rather isolated, insulated, and separate from the wider society. And we argue that from the medieval period forward, that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland, that the history of Poland is not complete without a history of Polish Jews, and that they are not only in Poland, but they are also of Poland. A spectrum of relations. You say Poland, you say Jews, the next word is anti-Semitism and Holocaust, as if that sums up this 1,000-year story. And it was very important for us to think rather in terms of a spectrum of relations. The spectrum of relations is a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration. Now, and that is critically important, because if we don't see this set of relations on a spectrum, we cannot understand how it would be possible for Polish Jews to become the largest Jewish community in the world and a center of the Jewish world. In the 18th century, there were 750,000 Jews living in the large territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that was half the Jewish population of the world. That doesn't happen. It does not happen if this is a story of 1,000 years of unmitigated horror. It just doesn't happen. We argue that Jews created a civilization that is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish. I'll try and show you how. And the power of telling the story in the very place where it happened. Now, that might seem obvious, but I can recall in the beginning when I was presenting this project, people would say to me, "Why are you making it in Poland?" And I said, well, you don't ask that about the Jewish Museum in London or the Jewish Museum in Paris or the Jewish Museum in Philadelphia. Where should we make it? They said, you should make it in New York or Tel Aviv. You should make it where the Jews are. I said, no. We're going to make it in the place where the story happened, and the power of coming to Poland, to this museum, to see it, and to understand it in the context of contemporary Poland is an extraordinarily powerful thing to do. As a multimedia narrative exhibition, we take the position that exhibitions are much better at communicating, if you will, at providing an experience than communicating information. If you want information, read a book, look it up on Google, take a course, pass an exam. But exhibitions in the hour and a half or 2 hours or 3 hours that you're there are a multisensory, multimodal experience. And so we actually begin our 1,000-year journey in a forest, and we begin it with a legend. And the legend is the story of POLIN, which is the name of the museum, and it's what's inscribed on those glass, basically those glass scales, if you will. And the story that we use, the version of the legend, we know the legend from at least the 19th century. The version that we use is from the great Hebrew Nobel Prize-winning literary figure of Agnon. And the story goes something like this. Jews fled from Western Europe. They were fleeing persecution, and they came east to find safety, and they found themselves in a forest. And then the legend varies. One version, the clouds break and an angel's hand points, and they hear the word POLIN. Another version, the birds are chirping, POLIN. In another version, they see Hebrew words that are carved on trees. Another version, they see pages of the Gemara floating down. They think they hear Hebrew, POLIN, here you shall rest. And they say to themselves, now we know that this is the place that we should rest, and we should stay here until the Messiah comes and we are taken to the land of Israel. Now that's a very, very, I would say, counterintuitive way to begin a 1,000-year historical narrative. Because what we've done is to create a space of historical imagination, to begin with a legend that Jews told themselves about where they came from, why they came, and why they stayed. And it's a legend that basically says that from a Jewish perspective, what the legend is communicating is a feeling of heaven, of belonging to this place. Despite all of the violence and all of the negativity that is also part of this story, this aspect of it is very important, and it's how we begin. Now, when we cross the threshold between legend and history, we enter the medieval gallery. And the medieval gallery takes us from about 965 to about 1507. So it's more than half of the millennium. For this period, for this more than 500 years, there are only two kinds of objects in the world that were made in Poland and are Jewish. Two: tombstones and coins. On the left, you see the oldest Polish Jewish tombstone. It's dated 1203. It's from the cemetery in Wrocław, which at that time was part of Poland. Today it is again. In between, it wasn't. And coins, they're bracteates, which is to say they're one-sided coins, and they were either minted by Jews who had a privilege to mint a certain number of coins, or they were made in mints that were supervised by Jews, and they have Hebrew inscriptions on them. And the Hebrew inscriptions say things like bracha, bracha v'hatzlacha, and they will also have the name of the ruler, Mieszko, for example. So these coins, I assure you, are not this size. They are the size of a penny, the size of a penny. And so, what did we do, given that we had so little to work with? First, I'm not going to make a cemetery to tell the story of 500 years of the medieval period, and I'm not going to make a whole gallery out of little coins. So, what we did was this. The first thing we did was we went to the rabbinical responsa to basically letters that rabbis sent to each other with questions and with answers, and we pulled from them stories that related directly to what was going on with these Jews that were wandering around in the wild East. And we used those stories to construct our narrative. Then we took illuminated manuscripts, Ashkenazi manuscripts, mainly from the Rhineland, as well as Christian ones, and we gave those stories and we gave those manuscripts to two of Poland's most famous and beloved comic book artists. And we said to them, what we want you to do is to illustrate those stories in the style of those manuscripts, which they did. And then we hired specialists in the conservation of painted interiors of medieval and Renaissance and early modern churches. And they hand painted these stories on the wall, and they hand gilded using real gold, this gold leaf, and using this technique of oil gilding, water gilding for the area that where we present the kings. And the result is a hand-painted gallery. So you walk into a gallery that tells the story of the very first Jews to come, and how by 500 years later, this place is about to become a center of the Jewish world and home to the largest Jewish community in the world. That's the story of that 500 years. And this hand-painted gallery is like being in an illuminated manuscript that is life-size and 360 degrees, together with interactive presentations of Jewish communal life and various other aspects. When we cross the threshold between the medieval gallery and the early modern period, which is to say the period from 1569 to 1772, we've divided this period in two, and the first part of the period is really about I would say, the enormity of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which has become perhaps the largest country in Europe because Poland had absorbed Ukraine and now joined with Lithuania to form the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it was one of the most diverse countries in Europe, with every denomination of Protestantism, Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, Tatars, Muslims. It was very diverse, and because it was so diverse and so big, the nobility, who were the dominant element, realized that without religious toleration, that this country would be torn apart just like the religious wars were tearing apart Western Europe. So as a result, Jews were one of many minorities, many religious minorities, because religious minorities were what mattered. They were among these religious minorities in a country that was exceptionally tolerant for early modern Europe. Now, we actually begin this gallery with a principle that runs all through the exhibition, and that is that we want this exhibition to be narrated in the voices of the period. That is, we want our visitors to, in a sense, come very close to the people whose story we're telling. And so we quote from these sources, and we try to keep our own voices as curators, as scholars. We keep them as a kind of second layer. And the inspiration for this gallery, which we call Paradisus Judaeorum with a question mark, Jewish paradise with a question mark, is inspired by a satirical poem that is, I would say, critical of everything about the Commonwealth. It goes something like this. The Polish kingdom is paradise for the Jews. What that means is that Jews have it too good. It's a criticism. Hell for the peasants, purgatory for the burghers, rule by servants, shelter for heretics, harvest for foreigners, fatherland for immigrants. It sounds like the EU today. So that statement, which is critical of everything, Jews included, we juxtapose it with a statement from Rabbi Moses Isserles, the great Polish rabbi, the Ramu or the Ramah, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And here's what he wrote in a letter to one of his students. Their hatred of us in this country has not overwhelmed us as in the German lands. May it remain so until the coming of our Messiah. In other words, he had low expectations. But you have to understand that for the early modern period, this is an extraordinary statement. But then you have other statements from a Karaite, from a nobleman. Some are positive, some are negative. In other words, it's a multi-voiced story. Sometimes those voices are like a choir. They're singing in harmony. And other times, those voices are disagreeing. It's a cacophony. And we would like our visitors to add their voice to the story. Now, this period is considered a golden age, both from the perspective of Polish history and Jewish history. And we feel that golden age is a cliche, and we don't really want to characterize the period in that way. We'd rather ask the question, if you will, in what ways was it a paradise? In what ways was it not? And in terms of what made it very special from a Jewish perspective, there were two things. One was a very, very high degree of Jewish self-government, and the other was the rise of rabbinical authority, learning, yeshivas, scholarship, and Hebrew and Yiddish printing in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, how do you communicate something so abstract particularly to an audience that knows nothing about any of these things, and to our hardship case, the 15-year-old Polish boy. That is always, we think to ourselves, if we can reach the 15-year-old Polish boy, we are safe. And so we decided that the most material expression of this, if you will, what I would call the rise of Polish-Jewish civilization in this early modern period, the most material expression of it was, in fact, printed Hebrew and Yiddish books, very important ones. And we decided to make printing presses, which we thought we would use for our children. But it turns out adults love it as well. And they're printing the title page of the Shulchan Aruch with the notations of the great Rabbi Moses Isserles and many other things. And then the trick was how to open up those books, how to open them. And what we did was we created a kind of a library with these stenders, with these readers' desks, and we were able then to take a few key books and to digitize them and interpret them, and to allow our visitors to actually explore them, including a very rare and wonderful Kabbalistic scroll that has never been exhibited before, and you can actually enlarge it, and if you touch it, you can get an explanation, a translation, and we can introduce our visitors, for example, in this case, to the Jewish mystical tradition. We also, of course, in this period, the economic story is extremely important because Jews were instrumental as lessees, taking out leases and managing assets on the estates of the noblemen. And this created conflict between Jews and the peasants, who were in this region were Ukrainian Orthodox peasants. And as a result of all of these tensions that were, I would say, largely economic, but also exacerbated by differences in religion, there was an uprising, the Khmelnytsky uprising, a Cossack uprising, where these unhappy peasants and these Cossacks targeted the Polish nobility, the Catholic Church, and the Jews as the source of the problem. And the result was that a third of the Jewish community in the southeastern part of the Commonwealth, in fact, was murdered, and many left, they fled, others were forced to convert. And this was a century of war. But by the end of this period, the Commonwealth rebounded, Jewish communities reestablished themselves, the nobility rebuilt their towns, invited Jews back, and now we zoom in the 17th and 18th centuries on the most characteristic form of Jewish settlement, what we call the Jewish town. Now, what we mean by the Jewish town is these were towns that were largely private towns owned by the nobility, but there were also some royal towns, some ecclesiastical towns, but mainly it was in the private towns owned by the nobility that Jews settled. These were the economic hubs of these great agricultural estates, and these were market towns, and in these towns, Jews formed a substantial percentage of the population, a third, a half, 60, 70, 80, even 90%. In my father's town of Apatov, in the 1930s, there were 10,000 people, 6,500 were Jews. The city of Białystok before World War II had between 50%, 70% Jewish. If you could imagine Cleveland, 50 to 70% Jewish. Philadelphia, 50 to 70% Jewish. It's unthinkable. But this is a very characteristic, and it's unique to this region. You don't see it in France, you don't see it in Germany. It's specifically to this region. So now we zoom in and we ask ourselves, what was everyday life like for Jews who were living in these towns? And we have two centers of gravity. One is the marketplace, and around the marketplace we have the Jewish home, the tavern. We're probably the only museum of Jewish history that has a church, and it's in the church that we present the story of the heretic Jacob Frank. And the second center of gravity is the synagogue, which is to say the synagogue itself, life inside the synagogue, and life around the synagogue. Now, I would say that first of all, necessity is the mother of invention. And there were once hundreds of these wooden synagogues across the length and breadth of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Hundreds of them. Some of them died a natural death, that is to say, by fire. This particular one in Gwoździec, this one was burnt to the ground during World War I when the Russian front moved through Gwoździec, which is today in Ukraine, it was in Poland. And during World War II, the Germans destroyed all of them. Not one of these great wooden synagogues that were built mainly in the 16th and 17th centuries, not one of them survives. It just so happens that the one in Gwoździec is the single best documented one, extraordinarily well documented. That means photographs, it means architectural drawings, floor plans, cutaways, cross-sections, everything from every angle. And we had the opportunity to work with the studio. Some of you may have seen the film Raise the Roof, and you will know the story of our Gwoździec wooden synagogue ceiling and roof. So we were working with a studio called Hans House Studio in Massachusetts, and they have the most wonderful mission. They say that their mission is to recover lost objects. And what they say is you can never recover the original object in the sense of the original material, but you can recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And so that's what we did. We formed a team of 300 experts and volunteers, and we ordered 200 raw logs with the bark still on, and we had them delivered to an open-air folk architecture museum in the south of Poland, outside of Sanok, so a kind of Skansen museum. And we converted these logs with the bark still on into all the timbers and all of the panels that were needed in order to create the structure that would go into the museum. And we worked with the American Timber Framers Guild that are complete maniacs when it comes to timber framing. They will go anywhere to do timber framing, and they will bring with them their traditional tools, their adzes, their axes, their pit saws, their lathes, everything. They brought them in golf bags and in ski bags on the airplane, and they taught our volunteers, and it was like Lord of the Rings. And so here is this is a pit saw. And so these, and many of the volunteers had never, ever, ever done anything even remotely like this. And in 3 two-week workshops at Sanok, we actually did the full assembly of because we only reconstructed the roof and the painted interior ceiling at 85% scale. Now, I had wanted to do the whole thing 100% scale with the walls, but the director said he thought it was too much. So I had to settle for the roof and the ceiling. What we did then is to take everything apart, number the parts, store them in Sanok until we were ready to bring the parts to the museum, lay them on the floor of the exhibition, reassemble this structure, and hoist it and suspend it from cables. It's 25 tons? 25 tons, not 25,000 tons, couldn't be, 25 tons. We did the same thing with the painted ceiling. We divided the painted ceiling up into 8 sections, and we went to existing masonry synagogues in 7 different locations in Poland. So that meant in Krakow, in Warsaw, in Sejna, in Wrocław, in Kazimierz Dolny. And we had a 2-week workshop, and using traditional pigments and traditional tools, we created the painted ceiling. And this is the result. And it is absolutely, absolutely extraordinary. So the painted ceiling, and the roof comes up through an opening in the gallery, which the architect did for us, so that we could bring it up into the main hall. And there's a connection between the roof that you can see from the main hall with openings so you can see down into it, to the structure, and then the painted ceiling from underneath. And it's up on the above level in the main hall that we present the whole process of how we made it. The bima, which made the same way, is 100% scale. So even though the scales are not exactly right, I think it really works extremely well. And you can imagine, for visitors, this is really one of the most spectacular, meaningful moments in the entire exhibition. The interactivity gives visitors an opportunity to explore the iconography of the ceiling. We have artifacts that refer to prayer in everyday life, to women's piety, and my favorite are the kids. So what we have is these little cushions for the kids with straps. They wear them like a backpack, so they walk around the museum like turtles. And and when they come to the painted ceiling, they can take them off, lie down, and just simply look at this glorious painted ceiling to a world that was not simply the black and white of the Vishniak photographs that we know, but a world that was lived in vibrant, living color. And it runs completely contrary to the idea that Jews had no aesthetics, had no visual culture, were completely iconophobic, that they weren't allowed to paint animals, plants, or even the human figure. And then, basically, that big red map comes to an end starting in 1772. So that big red map represents the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was being governed or ruled by nobles. It was called a republic of nobles because the king was weak, the royalty was weak, the nobles had the power, and the country became very decentralized. And the Kingdom of Prussia and the Russian and Austrian empires said, this is the moment we're going to each take a piece of the royal cake. And so we introduced the long 19th century, 1772 to World War I, the long 19th century. What we want to do is to make it clear to our visitors, to communicate clearly that now Jews that have been living in this big commonwealth on that red map, we're now living in 3 completely different empires, in the Kingdom of Prussia and in the Russian and Austrian empires. And that if you don't understand the geography of the 19th century, you do not know where your families came from. Because all you know is that they say they came from Russia, but we think they were speaking Polish, but their passport says something else. But you have to understand the geopolitical situation that is the 19th century. And we asked the question, what was the impact on everyday Jewish life? How did all the new rules and regulations, some restrictions lifted, other ones imposed, dress reform, marriage age reform, conscription into the army, new role for rabbis, how did it affect everyday life? And what were the organized responses to these challenges, to these encounters with modernity? And we look at the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, we look at the modern yeshiva, and we look at the enormous efflorescence of Hasidism, which just took off exponentially in the 19th century. Now, when my scholars, when my academics told me that we have to present the modern yeshiva, I reminded them of the 15-year-old Polish boy. And I said, I just don't think he'll get it. And besides which, it sounds, you'll forgive me, I just don't think it sounds really like something you can exhibit. I said, well, show me the material. And they said, we have no photographs, no paintings, no drawings, no objects. Okay, so what do we have? So we commissioned research from a PhD student who was writing his dissertation on the history of the modern yeshiva in Poland in the 19th century. And we said to him, go to memoirs, go to travel accounts, go to autobiographies, and bring us material that describes the experience of either visiting or studying in one of these yeshivas. And when the material came in, I personally was completely blown away. The pedagogy of these modern yeshivas was stellar, and the descriptions were so visual and so dramatic. Our designer said, you know what we're going to do? We'll do an animation. And I thought to myself, I can't have an animation like The Simpsons or Disney or something like that. I mean, this is the 19th century. So my creative director said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do a painted animation. We're going to cast live actors, and we're going to paint them. And we're going to make the scenography in the studio, and we're going to shoot the live actors in a green room, and then you can take what you've shot, and you can put it together. And we're going to have 24 hours in the yeshiva of Volozhin in 4 minutes, 45 seconds. And that's what we did. And we're going to do it in the style of a 19th century painting. And we had specific Jewish painters who had actually painted small scenes of men studying around a table. And that's precisely what we did. And it turns out that in the absence of any visual material, in the absence of any objects, we actually were able to create one of the most memorable moments in the entire exhibition. We come to the middle of the 19th century gallery. We set the, if you will, the shift in direction and the speeding up of change. We set it in a train station because the train, the building of the railroad and the role of entrepreneurial Jews in financing and overseeing the construction of the railroad is a very, very important story, because from it follows industrialization, urbanization, social mobility, and the growth of really big cities and big industrial cities like the city of Lodz. And it's a story that we carry through the 19th century, and it's a story that includes, among others, the rise of modern anti-Semitism, particularly in the 1880s and 90s, with the pogroms that broke out in Russia. It includes all kinds of developments, I would say, of modern racial anti-Semitism, Protocols of Zion that we present. And it also presents many, many different ways that Jews responded to the encounters with modernity, not least through the rise of modern Jewish political and social movements, and the rise of modern Jewish, Hebrew, and Yiddish culture. So here, for example, Peretz, if you will, is the iconic figure. We bring the long 19th century to a close with World War I. With World War I, the empires collapse. Russian Empire is gone, Austrian Empire is gone, there's a unified Germany, the Ottoman Empire is gone, and it's in this period that the Second Polish Republic forms, and for the first time since 1772 to 1795, for the first time since the late 18th century, Poland is now again an independent country. It's the Second Polish Republic, but for only 2 decades, for the 1920s and 30s. Now, it's very important to us to keep our visitors in the moment of the story, and this is true all the way through the 1,000 years. We don't want our visitors to be foreshadowing the Holocaust. We don't want our visitors to be looking at this 1,000-year history backwards, backshadowing it through the lens of the Holocaust. We want to keep them in the moment of the story. And that's why we use only primary sources from the period and why we narrate in what I call the historical present. What that means is that as a visitor walks through the story, the future is never very far ahead, but the past keeps on getting deeper, 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 deeper the further along they walk into the story. So we've set this short period of time on a 2-story street. This is in fact a white relief surface on which we have projected the street, and we call it on the Jewish street, from the Yiddish expression, was tut sich auf der jüdische Gas? What's doing on the Jewish street? In other words, what's doing in the Jewish world? And then we've organized this 2-story street along 4 thematic lines: culture, politics, growing up, and daily life. And this was a period in which Jewish political culture was very, very vibrant, very, very lively, and where, of all the options that had developed at the end of the 19th century, there were 3 winners. Zionism, which appealed to all strata of the Jewish world, the Aguda, the Orthodox Party, and the Bund, the Jewish labor movement. And the great achievement of Jewish politics was not electoral. It was rather in the total way of life that it offered their adherents. That meant a full suite of schools, hospitals, all kinds of interest-free loans, support, culture, drama, mandolin orchestras, and the like. And the timeline for this short period actually begins to set the, if you will, the trajectory that leads towards 1935, the death of Pilsudski, and the rise of the worst period of anti-Semitism probably in the history of modern Poland, the period between 1935 and 1939. The story of culture, we actually started with the flowering of Yiddish culture because Jews were one of several legally recognized national minorities in interwar years Poland, because during the peace process at the Treaty of Versailles included a set of annexes or clauses to protect national minorities in these new countries. And during this period, you have to realize that up to 40% of the population of Poland was not ethnically Polish. They were Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian, German, Czech, and of course Jewish. And Jews were 10% of the population, but where they lived, they formed 60, 70, 80, and more percent. And so we begin, first of all, with the flowering of Yiddish, Yiddish schools, Yiddish papers, Yiddish culture, and our beautiful press wall, which just shows the incredible variety and range of the Yiddish press. And in the area on growing up, what we do is to really show the generation gap and the concern, the worry about the future of Jewish youth. And one of my favorite sections in the thematic area of growing up is the courtyard and the autonomous world of the Jewish child. That is to say, an area that's dedicated to the culture that children create for themselves, not only the culture that is created by adults for them. And in this case, I had a very special opportunity, and that is that I had interviewed my father for more than 40 years, starting in 1967 until he died about 9 years ago. And among the many, many interviews, I'm trained as an anthropologist, among the many, many interviews that I did with him is I interviewed him about all the toys he could remember making and playing with when he was a child. Because he said nobody could afford to buy toys. His parents never bought him any toys, but he made toys, and he made for me and recalled and described and taught me how to make most of more than 25 toys. And so, for our Growing Up exhibition part, I Made the Toys. And I taught our educators how to make the toys. And our educators are teaching our visitors how to make the toys and how to make them out of paper, string, you probably know these yourselves, cat's cradle, a whiz button, a hat, a boat, a knucker, a noisemaker, but the best, well, two of the best of them are the mouse out of a hanky and the buckhorn, or it was called in Yiddish, it was called a schäufer or a trompeta. And that's my father in the middle in the 60s when he first made me a schäufer out of the bark of the willow in the spring when the twigs are where the bark slips off very, very, very easily. And of course, the great pride of interwar year Poland was the Jewish school system, the Tarbut, the Zionist school system of teaching Hebrew, the Tzisho schools, the Yiddish school system, the Polish language Jewish gymnasia, and of course the traditional cheters and yeshivas. And the last section is the section dedicated to everyday life across the length and the breadth of the Second Polish Republic in many different kinds of locations, geographical, and different kinds of towns. Now, it was very important for us that when visitors looked down the street, they didn't see the Holocaust. What they saw are people looking up. And it wasn't until they turned the corner that they saw what they were looking up at. And what they were looking up at was bombs falling on Warsaw. And then they discovered who were the people looking up. It was September 1st, 1939, that the Germans invaded Poland, and a few days later, the American ambassador and his staff are standing outside the American embassy in Warsaw, getting ready to evacuate, and they're looking up at the bombs falling. And so what we do at the Holocaust Gallery is we set it not within a 1,000-year history of anti-Semitism, we set it within a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. And that is, I would say, actually not so unusual in European Jewish museums, actually here as well. The Holocaust is set within a history of the Jews of Cleveland and Eastern Ohio, and similarly in Amsterdam and similarly in London. And to set this story within the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, though, is special. Why is it special? Because Poland became the epicenter of the genocide, because it was in Poland that the Germans built all the death camps. And it was in Poland to which they brought all the Jews of Europe. And so the telling of this 1,000-year story in this place and the telling of the Holocaust within this 1,000-year story, and we tell it in a very particular way. So the Holocaust is set within the borders of occupied Poland, within the borders of the Second Polish Republic, within the borders of occupied Poland. And the approach is to present essentially what we call the imposed reality along one side and the Jewish response on the other. So it's not simply perpetrator history, it's not simply, if you will, victim history, it's rather about that relationship between the imposed reality and Jewish response. And we have unique material for being able to do that. And although we present the full picture of the Holocaust throughout occupied Poland, of course, when we tell the story of separation and isolation through a set of processes of humiliation, marking, forced labor, separation in space, plunder, of course, the ultimate step is the forming of the ghetto. And our principle is what we call pars pro toto, and that is, rather than present a little bit from here and a little bit from there, we'd rather take one case, present it fully, and use it to try to communicate the larger phenomenon of what a ghetto was. Now, Warsaw was the largest ghetto, but it was also very exceptional for another reason, which I'll explain in a moment. But here in the Warsaw Ghetto, what we've done, consistent with the principle that I mentioned earlier of narrating through primary sources and multiple voices, we have on the right Adam Czerniaków, who was the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish council, which the Germans had established. And in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, it was his task to carry out their orders and to run the ghetto. And on the left, we have Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a great historian, a specialist in the history of Warsaw Jews. He was a left labor Zionist. He kept a diary in Yiddish. Czerniaków kept a diary in Polish. Those diaries survived, and we quote from their diaries and from their contrasting perspectives all the way through the Warsaw Ghetto presentation. And in the case of Ringelblum, he's exceptional because he organized a secret archive, the Oinig Shabbos archive. It was called Oinig Shabbos, Joy of Sabbath, because his team would meet in secret on Saturdays, and that was their code name. And this secret archive was, what they did was the team was collecting everything. They were collecting diaries, letters, postcards, ration tickets, counterfeit coins, German posters, photographs. They were making reports. They were collecting everything. They were amassing thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. They originally thought that they would survive the war, and after the war, they would write a book about the Warsaw Ghetto based on those documents. But during the Great Deportation in the summer of 1942, when they realized they were not going to survive, they packed that archive up into tin boxes and then a second cache into these milk cans, and they buried this material in 2 places in the Warsaw Ghetto. And 300,000 Jews were deported, 60,000 Jews were left in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then a few months later, just before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, when they saw that this was absolutely the end, those who had survived buried the rest of the archive in a 3rd cache. Immediately after the war, several people who were part of the Oinig Shabbos team, who had survived, went out into the rubble of the ghetto, into that vast ocean of rubble, where there are no streets and there are no street signs, and they were able to locate 2 of the, well, actually they located 1 cache. They located 1 cache. The second cache was found by accident when there was a digging of a foundation, and there was a digging through the rubble, and the second cache was found. And what we've done is to use that material of documents that were created on the spot at the time by people who were in the situation and who did not know what was going to happen next. And that's exceptional because we want our visitors to bracket what they know happened later and to put themselves in the position of people who had a very, very short horizon forward. We think that's an exceptional opportunity. And as a result, there's no Holocaust testimony, there's no video of Holocaust survivors in this presentation. For that, we have a resource center, and in the resource center, we have the whole Shoah archive. We have access to the Shoah archive, and we're able to use that material. But here, the idea was to keep our visitors in the moment, at the place, with the materials from the very, very place. We then shift from the Warsaw Ghetto to what we call the Aryan side, and we look at Polish-Jewish relations during the war, again on a spectrum from the absolutely worst to the absolutely best, with an enormous territory in the middle and a very complicated story. Now, many said to us that we should have ended this story with the Holocaust, that should be the end. And I think probably from a perspective outside of Poland, that makes sense. Because if you recall, if you've been to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York, you know that at the very end on the 3rd floor, the post-war period is about Israel and America, no Europe. Europe is just simply a closed chapter, it's over. But in fact, it's not over. And the post-war story, the story of post-war Poland is a really, really important story. And it's a story that is untold and basically unknown I think, for most of our visitors. And so we begin this story by bringing our visitors into the destroyed world that survivors found. Now, there were 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland before the war, and 90% of them were murdered. And most of those who survived in the Soviet Union. They were saved by deportation, literally. However horrible it was, in fact, they had a better chance of surviving there. There were about 50,000 Jews that half of which came out of hiding, and the other half, maybe 25,000, came back from concentration camps. And they came back to a destroyed world. They came back, they may be the only person who survived from their family or the only person who survived from their town. And so the biggest question was whether to stay or to leave. And we've structured this gallery so that the story of leaving is on the right and the story of staying is on the left. And that dilemma of staying or leaving is what structures this post-war gallery all the way up to the fall of communism. Now, of course, being on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto Monument, we tell the story of the monument because we have incredible material for telling the actual story of the competition, of the making of the monument, the unveiling of the monument, for which we have newsreel footage narrated in Yiddish, which is kind of amazing. And we also tell the story of post-war violence. And this is the most, I think, for people living in Poland today, and I think for Jews in the world, and particularly for survivors, it is just unimaginable that having survived the Holocaust, that between, in 1945, 1946, 47, that these people who had managed to survive would have been subjected to pogroms and to post-war violence. It's just simply, it's simply unimaginable. And we are unflinching in the presentation of it, and this is really important. And the way that we do it, I think, is also quite brave. And we do the following. The iconic event is, of course, the Kielce pogrom, July 4th, 1946. And we present it by starting with the Jewish community of survivors in Kielce, who had a kibbutz in an apartment on 7 Planty Street. And they were young survivors, and they had recovered, and they were on their way to Palestine. Some had already left, and others were getting ready to leave. And then there was a rumor that a Christian boy in the building had gone missing, and that the Jews, had kidnapped him, murdered him, and to use his blood for matzah or whatever. And a pogrom broke out. And it was, I would say, it was a huge shock. It was a huge shock within Poland, and it was a huge shock actually worldwide. And it is remembered to this day, and it is commemorated to this day. And so what we've done is we present what we call the bare facts, and we present extraordinary newsreel footage of the period of the funeral, and then we present 4 interpretations of the event from the period, not from after 1989, not from Jan Gross, not from the debates, but from the period. What did the anti-communist underground say? What did the communists say? What did the Bishop of Kielce say? He actually blamed the Jews. What did what we call the moral voice, the independent voice, say? And we ask our visitors to actually try to fathom the kind of thinking that came as an outcome, as a result of this pogrom. And then on the right, we present other examples of post-war violence. And between 1945 and 1948, there was emigration panic. And I would say half of the survivors who had come back to Poland, about 250,000 people, about half of them, more than half of them, left between 45 and 48. And so, and here you can see another angle of it. And we tell the emigration story, the story of the DP camps. But here on the right are the other locations where there was post-war violence, and we present the documents. And those visitors who really would like to dig deeper can pull out those drawers and can actually explore the original documents that really explain precisely what happened. And I think it's actually very important to the credibility of this museum that we are unflinching in presenting some of the absolutely worst aspects of the story. Now, on the left is the story of staying, and particularly we asked ourselves the question, what was Jewish life like under communism? Because it's a question I never asked myself. And it's a very interesting story, and we've created settings where our visitors can explore Jewish life in an organization that was called The Club, that was part of the Social and Cultural Association of Jews in Poland, which was the only organization that was officially allowed after the onset of Stalinism. And actually that organization continues to exist to this day. I think, although it wasn't violent, in many ways, I consider the last major moment of emigration to be, in some ways, the worst. Not because of violence, but for another reason altogether. So in 1968, after the Six-Day War, the Soviets and Soviet, I would say, influenced countries took the side of the Arabs. And for a variety of internal political reasons, Jews were targeted as a fifth column. They were called Zionists, they were called people with divided loyalties, they were harassed, some of them couldn't keep their jobs, and there was the last major wave of emigration. Because by 1968, through these waves of emigration over the course of several decades, there were maybe 20,000 Jews left in Poland. And as a result of this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic campaign, about 13,000 Jews left, and now there were about 6,000 Jews. But the Jews who left were the ones who didn't want to leave. They were the ones who had stayed. They were the ones who had thought of themselves really in very much identified with Polish language, with Polish culture. And what happened was very, very interesting, because there was the fundamental assumption that as a result of this campaign, that the Jewish world was finished. It was over. And it was, you could just, basically and fundamentally, you could simply close the book. But what happened in this period, in the late 1970s and the 80s, were a phenomenon called the seedlings. And they were the children of parents who stayed for whatever reason. Either they weren't affected by this anti-Semitic campaign, but these children who never thought of themselves as Jewish, all of a sudden, it seemed to matter. And for those who felt that it mattered, they decided, if you'll call me Jew, I'm going to be one, but I don't know how. I call them Jews from scratch, because they literally had to figure it out, and they turned to the Jewish catalog. They looked to American Jewish peers to figure out how to be Jewish in a modern way. They didn't want to be Jewish in a pre-war way. They wanted to be Jewish in a modern, contemporary way like their peers. And they became the seeds of the renewal of Jewish life in Poland. And after the fall of communism, this renewal really took off. And although it still is relatively small, it's extremely, extremely important. And it's here in the very, very last section of the post-war narration of the post-war gallery that is the first time that we present video interviews. And in this case, video interviews with Jews living in Poland today. And we ask them to answer a series of questions. Is there a future for Jews in Poland? Is there anti-Semitism in Poland? What does religion mean to you? What does Israel mean to you? Who can make Jewish culture? But the best question of all, the one I would never think to ask here, is, did you always know you were Jewish? And that, the answers to that question put into play any assumptions that I would have had, presumably that you would have, about what it means to be Jewish. And that's another whole discussion, but that, the renewal of Jewish life and the role of these, if you will, seedlings in that renewal is extraordinary. And at the same time, there is enormous interest on the part of the Polish public in all things Jewish, without which this museum could never be the success that it is. Now, the story is probably told more in, I would have, if I had had more control, I would have made this a more transnational story. But creating it in Poland under the conditions that we did, it was very much set in Poland with much less about Jews, Polish Jews that are not in Poland, than I would have liked. However, given that almost 14 million Jews in the world, and it's estimated by Zvi Eckstein, who's a very important demographer, that 70% have their roots in Polish lands, meaning that big red map, which is today Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus. That's about 9 million Jews. Where do they go? What do they take with them? How does the legacy of Polish Jews shape their lives today? This is your story. This is my story. Now, what is this photograph? So, as you know, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, particularly from this territory, they formed Landsmannschaften. They formed hometown societies. And my father's hometown society had a branch in Toronto and a branch in New York and a branch in Tel Aviv. And as his generation and as the survivors got older, the numbers dwindled, and by the end, he said, it's hardly worth going for that breakfast on Sunday at the synagogue. There's only 9 guys left, and it was like the end of the Landsmannschaft. And then there's a guy in his 60s who decides to revive the Landsmannschaft. And so he makes a website, he rallies everybody, and I get a message, because of course I belong. And the message says, on Sunday at such and such, we're going to take a picture of everybody from Opatów. 90 people showed up, including infants. And there's like 5 generations here. So there's Holocaust survivors that are now very elderly, their children, their children, their children, and all of them are, quote, from Opatów. And so for me, this photograph really symbolizes a kind of ongoing connection to the 5th generation, at least among some. Obviously, it's not everybody. And so what we want to do is in a circulation space that is at the center of the exhibition, because our exhibition goes around in a circle, and at the very center of the exhibition is a circulation space. And what we want to do is to tell that story, but in a way that's very poetic, a little bit like our forest. That is, not a conventional gallery, not a conventional exhibition, not a lot of information, but something that will tell the story of Jews in 7 big locations: North America, South America, Australia, South Africa, Western Europe, Israel, etc. And we hope to be able to do that. That's right now our current project, is to complete the story by expanding the geography of the story to all the Jews who left this territory and settled in other places. So thank you very, very much. So actually, I'm told that we can take questions.
Yeah, so what we'll do for questions, because we have such a big audience, I'm going to ask you, if you have a question, to please come up here. You can line up behind this microphone over here, or the microphone that's over there, and we'll be happy to entertain.
Very, very happy to get questions, et cetera. And of course, you know that this is really what this is really about. Is it's an invitation to come to Warsaw and to visit the POLIN Museum. That's what it's really about. Oh, yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Extremely interesting. I have two short questions. One, is the wording in the exhibits given in English in addition to Polish and Yiddish or whatever languages that may be given in? And the second one is, I didn't hear you mention a section about the cultural contributions of the Polish Jews throughout the period. Is there a part where that's given? Thank you.
Thank you. Both of them. So I'm glad you asked about language, and I'll tell you why. So first of all, the languages of communication are Polish and English. However, it was very important for us to communicate the multilingual nature of our story. So when we have an important quotation that is communicating a major message, it's big, it's high, and it's in the original language. And it's in a historical font from the period. So medieval, early modern, the 19th century, so that what you get is graphically, even if you can't read the language, you get the message that this is a story that is multilingual, multi-denominational, multicultural, and I don't have to say it all the time. That's what an exhibition is supposed to do. It's supposed to do it and not say it. It's supposed to show it. And so what we do is, and you saw it on that wall of words, we present it in the original language and then in Polish and English translation, always, always. And so what languages are there? The first language you encounter is Hebrew. The second language you encounter within 2 meters of entering the gallery is Arabic, which I think is, and I love it. People say, Arabic? Why Arabic? Why? Because it's from the travel account of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, a Jew from Cordoba that was sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission across Europe, and who left an extraordinary travel account, and of course he wrote in Arabic. It was Muslim Spain. It was the golden age of, or the so-called golden age of Muslim Spain. And today, the two things that kids in Polish schools know about Jews in Poland are Ibrahim ibn Yaqub and the Holocaust. Now, why do they know about Ibrahim ibn Yaqub? Because the very first description of Poland is in his travel account. So so that's the language story. But the languages are Hebrew, Arabic, Yiddish, original Polish, original English, French, German, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Czech, and I'm trying to think, Latin. So at least 11 languages, at least 11 languages. Now, Jewish contributions. So basically, our approach is to feature important individuals when they appear in the narrative. When they appear in the narrative. So for example, when we present the creating of the railroad, and we know that there were several Jewish entrepreneurs, Jan Bloch, for example, or Leopold Cronenberg, they were key figures in the creating of the railroad. But our story is about the railroad. It just so happens that they played a major role. So it's not that we're looking for people who play major roles to present them. We have a story to tell, and to the extent that there are key individuals in that story, they appear there. Now, there's a tremendous interest, and particularly I think on the part of our stakeholders and many of our visitors, that there should be some way to acknowledge exceptional individuals and their distinctive contribution not only to Polish culture, but to world culture. And so we've actually created a separate space that's not part of the exhibition, a completely separate space that is really kind of, I would call it a space of honor. And it's on the main floor, and it's in a ceremonial room that overlooks the monument, and it's a separate space, and in that way we can keep, I would call it a pure historical narrative, what it is, and then try to do justice to these exceptional people. And that's a solution that we chose. Yes, please.
Thank you, Barbara. Wonderful work. I just need to know a quick thing. In terms of this mega scale project, in today's world of managing projects, things like that, we consider Olympic as a mega project, right? $30 billion to $50 billion scale. So what is the scale of this project? And although it's a public-private partnership, if there was any distribution you can comment on. Thanks.
Sure. So basically, the public partners, the city and the ministry, they put up more than $70 million US for the building. You could never build that building for $70 million US here. It's out of the question. I mean, basically, you can multiply anything by 3 or by 4 if you really want to know the value. So $70 million for the building. And this little NGO that had never raised a cent, they raised more than $40 million for the core exhibition, an additional 10 million plus for educational and cultural programs while we were creating the museum, so there would be some kind of presence as we went. And then we continue, I work with the association to continue to raise funds because the city and I would say the city and the ministry provide a little more than a third to a half of the budget, which is mainly for operations. That means custodians, security, a few of the top staff positions. But we have to raise the rest of the money for program, and especially now for this final section on Polish Jews in the world. So that's, and that comes from private individuals, it comes from corporations, it also comes from the European Union and from what we call the Norway Grants. That is, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland are not in the European Union, so they do their own philanthropy. And so we were able to receive a very significant gift from them, specifically for our education programs, which won this Europa Nostra Award for the best education programs in Europe. So they're very happy, and I hope they'll come back and continue to support us. Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you. I had the honor of being in the museum after the Berlin Conference of Child Survivors. 4 of us were invited to visit the museum, even though it was not open, but we had the director show us through the docent, who was second generation from Lodz, showed us through the museum. They opened the doors just for us, and that was a wonderful experience. It was not finished yet, but 4 of us traveled from Berlin just so we could be there. At the same time, they had a Lodz gathering, world gathering in Lodz. So some of us had to go there. We were kind of torn between, but being that I was liberated near Warsaw, and during my hiding, I was in Warsaw in several places. And as a child, I did not know the Jewish history because I was about 4.5 years old when the war broke out. To me, that was so important to see the culture, the painters, the writers, to see what the Jewish culture was. And I was so proud that this happened because people come from all over the world and they see the Jews as a very kind of farmers and peasants and Orthodox, and none of the culture is known to people from around the world. So this is something that's very important that the world can see.
Thank you, and I hope you'll come back now that it's finished.
Thank you.
You've got to come back.
I'm hoping to.
Thank you.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation, and congratulations on that monumental achievement.
Thank you.
We took a congregational group to Eastern Europe a few years ago, and we had a very lovely philo-Semitic Polish guide throughout our trip. And I asked her 3 or 4 times the same question, and I could not get her really to understand the question, which was, do you see the Holocaust as not just a loss of, as a horrible tragedy involving the Jews, but as a loss of Polish culture, tradition, and history. And she couldn't integrate the concept of Jew and Poland. And you mentioned earlier that you wanted people to see this as a Polish story and not just as a exclusively exotic Jewish story, as separate from Poland. I'm wondering if you're doing any surveying or research to see if you're getting across to the visitors to the museum this rather complicated message about their own cultural identity and the message that the museum's intending to send to that 15-year-old Polish boy.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the best comments we get is, usually it's from an older visitor, is that, this is actually a museum of Polish history. That's the comment. And what's marvelous about that is there is a museum of Polish history being created now. And for someone to say, this is a museum of Polish history, is a way of saying, what's happening is this: it is a museum of Polish history, but not a museum of the history of the Polish state or the Polish nation. It's a history of Poland which conveys the experience of one of its many minorities, and to recognize that as a history of Poland is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Now, the history of Poland that will be shown in that museum will be a history of the state, it will be a history of the nation, and its key word is freedom, fighting for freedom. It'll be about martyrs and heroes and about, major events and that kind of thing. So, and the answer is yes. We're doing extensive visitor surveys. We've already collected 22,000 visitor feedbacks, answers to the question, why did you come to the museum? And the second question is, what do you most remember about the exhibition? You wouldn't believe the answers. And plus, we're doing scientific. We hired a company to actually do very formal, very, very scientific analysis, both of those who come and those who have not yet come, because we have to reach them. Please.
Barbara, my name is Milt Maltz, and I just want to say it was wonderful, and thank you for coming to Cleveland and to our museum. We're going to have to meet and talk a little.
You bet. And I have to tell you, thank you. And if I may say, I have something to say, and that is I spent today at the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage, the whole day. And I visited everything. I visited the permanent exhibition. I visited the temporary. I visited that wonderful collection of Judaica from this temple. And I spoke with the volunteers and the docents. And it really, and I have to offer you my warmest congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. I do have a question. Tamara and I heard that Amnon Weinstein, who's a violin maker in Tel Aviv, spent a couple of decades rescuing violins that were put into the very bottom of pits all over Warsaw, hidden, buried. It was their way of showing their response to the Nazis. He renovated those violins, and Tamara and I went to Tel Aviv to meet with him and beg him to come to Cleveland so we could do a thing that we called Violins of Hope. And I wondered if you were aware of those, if you've seen that program. It'll be on the PBS station tonight at 10 o'clock, by the way, for those who want to see it this evening.
Great. And I know that you've done a wonderful exhibition that was very well received on Violins of Hope, and that there is the film, and I look forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Could I ask you, do you know the artist Waldemar Smolarek?
Excuse me?
Waldemar Smolarek. That's a Polish artist born in 1937. If you, afterward, I would present to you a painting to be donated.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
I just, I wanted to make some remarks and also ask questions about modern Polish Jews. In 2011, I had the opportunity to be in Warsaw during Rosh Hashanah, and we actually went to a Reform synagogue. And I don't remember the name of it, but I can't imagine.
Probably Beit Warszawa?
It was way out.
No, it's Beit Warszawa. It's way out there, yes.
And it was
in every way.
It was an amazing experience. And what startled us the most was that there were so many young families with young children, fully participatory in Hebrew, in German, in English, in Polish. And when we sat down to eat together, they didn't identify as being Jewish. And I was wondering if you had any insight on that. In addition, my question is, did the synagogue or the Jewish community, that whatever there is, what engagement did they have on the museum? By the way, we saw it being built and it was amazing. So.
Oh, great, thanks. Well, I would say this, that for a long time there was only the Nozik Synagogue, which is an Orthodox synagogue with separate seating for men and women. So that, and it's an historic building that was from the turn of the century. Then there was the development of, and they don't have reform and conservative. We have progressive, and then there's like more or less progressive. Is kind of how it goes. So the next development was the development of this Beit Warszawa, which was an initiative of Severin Ashkenazi, an individual who I once said to him, "Why are you doing this, Severin?" He says, "Well, you know," he says, "if something happens to Israel, Poland is going to be the solution." And he's preparing the ground. He's preparing the ground. You know, it's a very particular perspective. Let me put it that way. So Beit Warszawa has a very, very particular approach, and their approach is they never ask anybody whether or not they are Jewish. That is to say, whoever comes, and they do not ask. Now, it's the opposite at Nozik. They're very precise and very halachic. So the participation there is really governed by a much, much stricter code. But now there have been developments in between, and there's a very nice congregation called Eitz Chaim, which is also progressive, but I think of it as rather more conservative, conservadox. But it's within the progressive. Anything not Orthodox is progressive by definition.
This was the rabbi was Bert Schulman, and there was a guitarist rabbi from California.
That's Beit
and
Warszawa. That's Beit Warszawa. That's Beit Warszawa.
So, and were they involved at all with the museum?
Not really. I mean, I think basically we've formed a committee of representatives of Jewish organizations, and we meet at the museum, and we're trying to encourage much more of a relationship. But I would say that the role I see the role I see for the museum is this: that the question, "Did you always know you were Jewish?" leads to the phenomenon that the chief rabbi of Poland describes as, he says, "I don't know how many Jews there are in Poland. All I know is that the number increases without the birth rate going up." So, and that is very much the phenomenon of individuals finding out, sometimes younger, sometimes older, sometimes only on a deathbed of a parent. And so the question is, why was this information withheld? And when asked, very often what comes out is fear and shame. And one of the messages of the museum is that there is nothing to be afraid of, and there is nothing to be ashamed of. There is much to be proud of. And that those seedlings who basically relied on the Jewish catalog and whatever they could get, now have a 1,000-year reservoir of their own legacy from which to build their lives and the future of their families. And what's interesting in Warsaw is that it's now a maturing Jewish community, so that you have now intact Jewish families that are raising Jewish children, where a generation ago, an individual might be the only Jewish person in a completely Catholic family. And in Krakow, it's a younger Jewish community, so they're just sort of, starting to build. But I would say the renewal is small, but it's incredibly important. And its scale shouldn't be, its importance should not be diminished because of its scale.
Thank you. Thank you so much.